Hello. In this session, technologies for precision pork production. We'll have excellent presenters. Our industry keeps embracing smart farming to further improve productivity through application of new technologies to better manage and monitor performance, health, behavior, and well-being of pigs. In this session, we'll explore areas that are integrating advanced technology into existing farm practices to improve animal health, productivity, while we optimize labor required. The industry is accelerating the speed of adoption and implementation of this technology into large commercial systems. Interdisciplinary collaboration is key to achieve levels of innovation, and this session will present an excellent information that could translate in further collaboration and great progress. Welcome. Our first presentation is Machine Learning as a Tool for Animal Health and Productivity. It is presented by Dr. Kimberly VanderWaal from the University of Minnesota. Dr. VanderWaal is an assistant professor of population medicine. She will be talking about the application of machine learning that is much needed on the many opportunities that our industry has. We're honored to have Dr. VanderWaal.
All right, thank you, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. The organizers have asked me to share about some of our recent work on machine learning as a tool for animal health and productivity. So in the past decade or so, the use of big data has increased exponentially, and this is partly due to the rise of smartphones, wearable technologies, other sorts of sensors that have really accelerated the rate at which we are able to essentially acquire data and generate big data. And as a result, we have had to bring new tools to bear that are better able to analyze and make sense about all of the data that is now emerging from a variety of sources. So machine learning has really been a tool that has followed along with big data in terms of providing the methods needed to actually go from just having big data to be able to create any sort of meaningful information from that information or from the data. So big data is typically considered to have several different qualities. The first is data volume, which is just essentially the big part of big data. Data is rapidly moving into the terabytes and beyond in terms of the amount that can be generated even from a single project or fairly simple devices. The second characteristic of big data is data velocity. So this is data collection is really about going to the field once, collecting a batch of data, and bringing it back to your computer and analyzing it once. So we're increasingly moving to a situation where data is being generated continuously and in near real time, and we've had to come up with new tools to actually be able to update our analyses to take into account the fact that that data is something that we can now think of it as continuing to accrue constantly through time. And then the final characteristic of big data is data variety. So this is where we really get into the complexity. This variety can be the number of different formats that data is now flowing in. This could be audio, visual type data. It could be free text, animal movement data, health records, etc. But essentially, we're moving from a situation where data can be, contained into a simple spreadsheet to a situation where just extracting the information from the data source can be quite complex, and then figuring out how all of those different pieces fits together presents a major challenge. However, if we can combine these three aspects of big data, we can really generate the potential or the value from the data, which is the meaningful and actionable insights that can improve decision making. So data science is the process of extracting knowledge, generating information, and creating insights from data. So machine learning algorithms have been proposed as the main suite of tools that we apply to big data and to other types of data as well. But essentially, machine learning algorithms learn underlying patterns in the past data without any human intervention in order to make better predictions for new data. And we'll talk a little bit more about how machine learning or computers learn without human intervention. But some major advantages of machine learning is that they're scalable to large data sets with many potentially collinear variables. So they're able to handle both the volume and the variety that we see in big data. And they also can handle non-linear relationships and multi-way interactions. So we're getting into the part where the pattern in the data may not be apparent by looking at a single one or two variables, but if we start able to build or combining variables and looking at interactions amongst all of those variables, we can discern clear patterns and potential predictions from our data sets. Now, some potential disadvantages of machine learning is that they have a tendency to overfit, which we'll talk a little bit more about that. They can be difficult to interpret, and part of that is because many of us don't have training in machine learning, so we don't necessarily understand the types of outputs that we get. And then, as much as we say that machine learning are algorithms that analyze data without human intervention, I would say that there's a great deal of human expertise involved in selecting the right algorithm and tuning that algorithm to the particular analytical problem. So it's really not a mechanism that doesn't require a great deal of human or training by a data scientist. And then finally, machine learning is often criticized of being black box in terms of we don't necessarily understand completely how they work, and it's you just kind of put your data in and you get some output out. But I want to break down that a little bit to talk about basically what most machine algorithms actually do. So let's take a simple example. We want to basically predict whether or not a person prefers to drink beer or wine. And we might have some pre-existing stereotypes about the typical beer drinker and the typical wine drinker. And then if you go into more nuanced, here's something I pulled from the web about who is the typical craft beer drinker. So we might have a variety of predictors, like someone who likes to eat organic foods or bikes to work, and we might have an age distribution for these beer drinkers. But essentially, we can start analyze the data and looking for the patterns to make these predictions. So one of my points here is that what machine learning algorithms do is actually fairly intuitive. If you gave me this problem and said, I want to classify people according to their drink preferences, I probably wouldn't immediately gravitate to plugging it into an equation. You might recognize this as the logistic regression equation. Certainly we can do that, and that's what we do in statistics and mathematics, but it is not particularly intuitive and kind of hard to actually explain to, a child or to your grandmother. However, machine learning, what most machine learning algorithms will do is they'll take, the simple attributes of your data. So in this case, we have age and we have income, and then each of these dots represents a person. The blues are the beer drinkers, the reds are the wine drinkers. And what a machine learning algorithm will do is it starts to look at a variety of different ways that essentially can subdivide the data and split it into two resulting groups. And so I might decide to split the data here along age, and now we have mostly wine drinkers in the older group, mostly beer drinkers in the younger group. I kind of made up this data, so don't hold me to this. But once it makes this split, then it takes these older people and then maybe does another split on these data to further subdivide and get like people with like people. And so eventually we continue to do this, and we have all of these resulting groups, which are a prediction. So my point here is that what the machine learning algorithm does is actually fairly intuitive. So when we talk about without human intervention, is we're not forcing the problem to fit into any pre-existing equation of how we expect these relationships to work, but instead we allow the computer to basically build up a predictive algorithm based on the observed data, and basically generate its predictors in that way. So this figure I pulled from a recent literature review about machine learning in agriculture. And what you can initially see is that so far, most of the applications of machine learning have been in the crop side of agriculture. And that's what this green bar represents here, with only about 20% of papers thus far having fallen in the livestock realm. And if we look at this inner ring here, they've broken down those into the actual purpose for which the machine learning was applied. And so in the case of livestock, we see significant efforts in livestock production, and then also in animal welfare, which animal welfare is a lot to do with welfare monitoring and actually being able to analyze audiovisual files to actually extract information about what's going on in a pen, for example. I also did a quick literature search on machine learning, specifically in swine. And then I actually applied a machine learning algorithm to basically cluster the papers by keywords. And these are the key patterns that emerged. So here are the major groups that the keywords are grouped into. And I roughly have grouped those into growth, production, carcass attributes, genotypes and phenotypes, and food safety and quality assurance. And part of these papers, or some of these papers, focus on automating data acquisition. So the processing of video and images, and the use of sensors, accelerometers, and other sorts of data acquisition technologies that can be used to address these sorts of issues. And then the second key types of questions that have been tried, that these papers have tried to answer, is how do we produce pigs with desirable attributes and phenotypes? So focusing a lot about feed efficiency, growth, slaughter age and weight, genetic markers of desirable phenotypes, and the use of omic data, which is a type of big data sets, or microbiome data, transcriptomics, metagenomics, etc. Now, I want to give a little bit of a shout out to Dr. Frances Shepard, who's just defended her PhD last month, and she used machine learning to do in silico prediction of rotavirus C B cell epitopes. And so this is a virus that does not have a cell culture-based approach in terms of being able to identify epitopes, but she did by some machine learning algorithms that actually predicted where these epitopes are likely to be within the viral genome, and then those can be then targeted for further study or to monitor or be monitored for looking for potential escape mutants. So there's our machine learning algorithms can be classified into two major groups. The first major group is called supervised learning. And in this situation, your input data is labeled. So essentially what I mean by labeled, it means that there's some sort of outcome that we're trying to predict. That could be a yes/no outcome. That could also be a continuous outcome. Maybe we're trying to predict slaughter age or something. And what I mean by that being labeled, they train a model to be able to predict this outcome based on a set of predictors. Broadly supervised learning can be split into classification algorithms, where our outcome is a categorical variable, or a regression, where our outcome is a continuous variables. And the predictive algorithms, some of them you have heard of, like logistic regression, others you may not have heard of, like gradient boosting and random forest. The other broad type of machine learning is unsupervised learning. So in this case, your input data is unlabeled. So we don't have a specific, outcome that we're trying to predict, but rather we're trying to train a model to find hidden structure within the data. So types of unsupervised learning may be clustering. So we're trying to identify groups of similar observations. So this is kind of what I did with those machine learning swine papers, where I clustered them by keywords. And some clustering algorithms that you may have heard of are k-means, hierarchical clustering, etc. The other part of unsupervised learning is dimensionality reduction, which is essentially methods to try to reduce the complexity of your data. So for example, if you have 40 different potential predictors or potential variables, it's much easier to run some of these other analyses if we can reduce the number of predictors. So we're trying to basically retain the variation in the data, but simplify it in a way that makes it a problem that we can actually analyze. So this would include things like principal components analysis, feature selection, and a wide variety of other ones. So the remaining part of this talk, I want to focus on two examples. The first example is the use of unsupervised learning for the classification of PRRS strains. And the second example is a case of supervised learning, where we'll be using supervised learning algorithms to forecast the risk of PEDV outbreaks in sow farms. And in this one, we'll talk a little bit more deeply about how we actually assess the model performance and determine which variables are most important. So PRRS virus is probably the most significant economic disease that affects pigs in the US. And Dr. Mike Murtaugh once told me that he thinks that PRRS is the most sequenced virus in the world. And I really do believe that. The amount of data that we have generated on the genetic variation of PRRS is just enormous and probably eclipses the number of sequences that have been generated for many human diseases even. And so the motivation of this work is we really want to understand when and why do certain variants of PRRS or PRRS strains go viral. And by viral, I mean that these genetic variants are the ones that spread widely in the industry. They kind of take over and they become the dominant or one of the dominant strains that are present at any given year. Over the past 10 years, around 50% of the PRRS sequences found in the US belong to the lineage 1 ancestral group. But within that group, there's an unknown number of strains. And so part of the first steps of this work is we want to define the strain structure of PRRS lineage 1 based on the inherent structure within the sequence data. So what we did is we grouped the sequences into strains such that we maximize the between cluster differences and minimize the within cluster variation. So we want all of the sequences for any strain that emerges from analysis to be highly similar to each other and maximize the differences we see between the different strains. And then we think that then we would have very well delineated strains. So we use two methods to do this. The first is discriminant principal component analysis, and the second is k-means. I won't go too much into the details of the how these methods work, but essentially this is one of the output plots that we get from this analysis, where we now have all of our different strains clustered according to their genetic variation. And we found that the best delineation between strains was achieved by grouping sequences into 8 different clusters. And once we've defined these strains, then we can put them back into our phylogenetic tree, where each color is a different cluster. We find that the within sublineage diversity on the OR5 gene is 5 to 6%, and the between sublineage diversity was 10 to 16%. And then we're able to start observing really interesting patterns, like in this case, lineage 1G seems to be a daughter lineage or a daughter group that emerged from the 1B sublineage. And at some point, 1G had evolved sufficiently that the algorithm said this sublineage is now different enough from the 1Bs to call it its own lineage or its own strain. And once we define these sublineages, we are able to start documenting the periodic emergence and then epidemic spread of new sublineages. So here we have going back through time, which each color representing kind of the rise and fall of each strain through time. And you see that there's this really characteristic pattern in basically how long it takes a strain to emerge, become the dominant lineage over the course of a few years, and then it declines after some number of years. All right, the second example I just wanted to highlight here at the end is our supervised learning example. And this is for forecasting outbreaks of PEDV, so that's porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. This project builds on the database that has been generated and maintained by the Morrison Swine Health Monitoring Project, which contains the weekly infection status of approximately 50% of the U.S. sow population. So we know where these farms are, and we know when they become or when they break with PED. Other information that we have is information on the animal movements between farms, and then we have spatial and environmental data. So we have all of this data available in retrospective formats where we know when and where these farms have broken with PRRS. And the goal of this project is to basically feed that data into a machine learning algorithm to actually build a predictive model that we can then apply in near real time, that we're able to actually use to give advanced 2-week warning of which sow farms are most at risk of breaking with PED. And if we're able to supply that information back to our partnering production systems, then they may be able to use that information to prevent or mitigate the impact of the outbreak. So the basic strategy that we've taken, you can imagine that this is a sow farm. The triangle is a sow farm in a landscape. And we draw a 5-kilometer circle around that farm, and we call that the neighborhood of the sow farm. And within that neighborhood, we have the locations of other farms, and some of those farms may be having PED outbreaks. We also have information about movements, not just into the sow farm of interest, but also we have information on when the neighboring farms are moving in pigs. And in some cases, we see that, for example, this neighboring farm has moved in pigs from a PED positive farm, which could represent a local introduction of PED into the area. And once the virus is in the area, then we expect that the likelihood of local area spread would be influenced by a variety of microenvironmental factors like land use, vegetation, weather and climate, et cetera. So we can include all of that information into our model. One of the challenges of machine learning projects is the challenge of imbalanced data. So this is a situation where the outcome of interest, in this case, does an outbreak occur, is very rare relative to when an outbreak doesn't occur. So in this case, we're predicting outbreaks on a weekly basis. Out of a whole year, only 1 week do we actually see the outbreak actually happening, or the new outbreak happening. And so therefore, if you can imagine you're trying to guess whether or not an outbreak's going to occur, you can the machine learning algorithm can guess no all of the time and be correct 98% of the time. But that still gives us no useful information about predicting when this outbreak is going to happen. So to deal with this, we use some data balancing methods available in machine learning. So for example, oversampling would take our minority class or minority observations, so our outbreak yes data, and basically replicate them up so that we have equal yeses and nos. Undersampling does the reverse. It takes our no data, basically randomly deletes a large number of samples up to the point where then we have a balanced yes-no data set. Now, both of those you could say probably have issues in terms of replicating data or deleting potentially useful data. So the machine or the data science method is something called synthetic minority class oversampling, which essentially, if the orange ones are our yeses, the blues are our nos, what this method will do is it creates synthetic samples that look kind of like our yeses, but they don't exactly replicate our yeses. It kind of does some interpolation to say, well, these are probably what they might look like. So this is a common method that you may see in machine learning papers or machine learning analyses. And then we used a machine learning algorithm called XGBoost, which is a tree-based algorithm, which is characteristic of many supervised learning algorithms. So I just want to talk kind of simply about how a tree-based algorithm works. So this will look similar to when we talked about the beer and the wine drinking, but imagine we have a population of farms. Some of them, the blue ones, will not have an outbreak. The red ones have an outbreak in a particular week. And basically what the algorithm will do is it'll look through all of our potential predictors and then all the different ways we can split the data based on that predictor, and it'll split the data alongside one of those. For in this case, receiving pigs from PED positive farms. And if you received pigs, you follow this part of the tree. And if you did not, you follow this part of the tree. And the goal is basically to split the data in such a way that you get like with like So we get all the reds together and all the blues together as much as possible. And then we keep splitting the data based on potential other predictors in our data sets until we have built out this tree. And then the tree can be used to make our predictions. So in this case, if you end up in this branch of the tree, most of the observations in this branch of the tree are no, so therefore the algorithm would say no, then a farm that would meet these characteristics would be predicted to say no. Now, most machine algorithms do not just build a single tree, because a single tree would be highly biased and probably not very powerful, but they'll build many, many trees. And this particularly algorithm uses a boosting approach to build all of those trees, in which each subsequent tree is constructed to try to predict the errors that the previous trees have made. So this is an example of an outbreak that occurred when in that previous tree or the initial tree, it was predicted that no outbreak should have occurred in a farm with those characteristics. So the basic flow of how this will work is we have our training data, we have our machine learning algorithm. The machine learning algorithm is trained to create a classifier. So basically that's our trained algorithm. And then we feed in new data into the classifier and make some sort of prediction. And then we can evaluate the accuracy of our model based on how well it predicts on new data. So one way to do that is cross-validation, where we basically run the model 5 different times. And each time we have split the data so that we only use 80% of the data to train the model, and then we test the model on the last 20%. And then we repeat that using different sets of data to test the model. And we use this essentially to try to prevent the model from overfitting to our data. So it has to be able to predict well on data that was not used to actually build the model. We could also do a test train scenario where we just hold out 80% of the data and then try to predict on the remaining 20%, which would be akin a little bit to trying to predict on future data that we may see that we want to make predictions about. And then we measure the accuracy of the model, usually through a confusion matrix, where we have the true states, so positive, negative, or yes, no, whether the farm had a break, and then what the model had predicted. And then we can extract variables that are, measurements that we might be used to seeing for diagnostics, for example. So in this case, the true positives over the total number that were actually positive, how many did the model actually predict? And in our case, the model predicted about 20% of the outbreaks that actually occurred, which you might say, well, that's not really great. But, prior to this project, we had no way to predict outbreaks. So I guess predicting some of the outbreaks is better than predicting no outbreaks or not having that information at all. And then the other piece of information that we extract is the positive predictive value, which is also known as precision in the machine learning world. And this is basically how often did predicted outbreaks actually occur? So how often was our algorithm right when it said that there was going to be an outbreak? And we have a positive predictive value around 70%. And we're pretty happy with that because we don't want there to be a lot of false alarms. We want that if we're flagging that we think an outbreak might occur, that information is, we're reasonably confident enough about that it makes it potentially justifiable to do some sort of intervention for that farm. The last piece I just want to briefly touch on is how we actually determine variable importance within our algorithms. So here's our tree again. And basically how we do this is we randomize the predictor variable relative to the outcome, in this case, whether or not there was an outbreak. And then we feed the data back through our algorithm and basically say, well, if we randomize this predictor variable, how much less accurate are we going to be? And if honestly, if the model makes, if we scramble this predictor variable and the model makes very few additional errors, then that predictor is probably not very important. However, if now the model becomes very inaccurate because we changed this variable, then we say, well, okay, that was probably a pretty important variable in predicting the outcome. So for our PED forecasting situation, this is the ranked variable importance plots, with the more important variables being on top and then moving to less important. And for predicting PED outbreaks in sow farms, the most important variable was moving in pigs from a PED positive farm. So that makes a lot of sense. If you're moving in pigs from a positive source, then yeah, there's a reasonable chance or a high chance that you will be at risk of having an outbreak yourself. Interestingly, though, also one of the most important predictors was the PED status of the farms that are moving pigs into the neighboring farms. So this is really interesting, that the neighboring farms' behavior in terms of, you know, where they're sourcing their pigs from can actually influence the risk of the PED or the sow farm of interest. And then you can see some other things in here that we might expect to see to be important, like hog density, season, etc. So we're now, for the past about 7 or 8 months, we've been using this pipeline to make real-time forecasts. So we deliver this information every week. We use about 6 weeks of movement data to basically predict the outbreaks, or the probability of an outbreak, about 2 weeks in the future. This is the type of report that our partners get. They get a basically list of all of their farms, and then the probability of an outbreak in each of those farms. And then they get kind of a graphical depiction about how this risk changes through time, where each of these lines represents one of their farms. And then the important thing about these sorts of projects, especially in the case of our forecasting project, is to have it be sustainable. So we don't want the future of the project to be based on having a full-time data science on our team, which is what we've been doing in the past 2 years, but we want to be able to automate the analysis and automate the prediction with a piece of software, which we've now built, so that these predictions can continue to be generated every week. And the other consideration that we had for this project is that we want to focus on data that's already routinely collected. There are probably a lot of other factors that are important for outbreaks that we have not considered here. But the fact is that data can be really hard to get. And if we want people to participate in this project for long term, if it's a type of data that is very onerous to actually collect and tabulate, then the ability for them to keep that effort up in a long term just might not be there. So we don't capture everything, certainly, in this machine learning algorithm that we built, but we do think we focused on factors that the data is readily available. And then we also want the platform, or the forecasting platform, to be scalable in terms of, you know, adding new participants. And also we've built in a feature to automatically update our machine learning algorithm so we can adapt to evolving epidemiological context. So whether that's a new disease or just that the context may change through time, so we can continue to automatically update the model to improve its, or allow it to adapt. And with that, I'd like to briefly just recognize or acknowledge all of the participating companies that have been part of this work, and then as well as the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory, which supplied all the sequence data for the first case study, and then my team for the second case study that have done an enormous amount of work on the forecasting pipeline. So that's Igor Poplawski and Rahul Bhojwani. And then I'd also like to acknowledge funding from both SCHIC, NSF, and USDA NIFA. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Dr. VanderWaal. What an excellent way to introduce us into machine learning. So next, our next presentation is Precision Pork Production, Current Possibilities and the Future Opportunities. It is presented by Dr. Tomas Norton from KU Leuven. Dr. Leuven is a professor at KU. Dr. Norton is a professor at KU Leuven in Belgium at the Division of Animal and Human Health Engineering. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'd like to start off by thanking the organizers for the invitation. It's nice to present the work that we've been doing and our ideas to the industry there in the US. So what I want to start off with is just an introduction to our team. So I'm a professor in the group that's called M3 Biores in the University of Leuven. And my team is focused on the animal side. We have a lot of different technical people. It's really a multidisciplinary team with computer scientists, bioengineers, an ethologist, a veterinarian, and also a mathematician that we try and keep on the ground. We really believe that we need such a wide disciplinary team in order to realize interesting ideas in this field. And of course, everything I present today is due to these guys. They're all working very hard. So what is the idea and what are we interested in? As we know that the big challenge to feed the growing population is sustainable intensification. So we know we want to produce more protein, but the thing is we need a lot more animals, and we need to do that in a sustainable way. So we need to produce those animals in a sustainable way. And the big challenge is there's a growing number of animals being farmed on an individual farm, and that's becoming a bigger challenge for the farmers to manage. Without the use of technology, it's becoming obviously more and more of a struggle. And also there is another thing when we look to the industry and the interest of the industry to younger generations, because you have this boom bust cycle. It's not an appealing industry to younger people, and it's a challenge that the industry is facing as well, of course. And this kind of issue where we're seeing farm numbers reducing, but the number of animals on a particular farm increasing, that's replicating throughout the world. We see the same problem in the US, the same problem in Australia, in Europe. So it's not just in a particular region. We're all experiencing this. And of course, the end result is that we're facing a point where the kind of production that was done in the past, where a farmer had a good understanding of his animals on an individual level, this of course is not achievable anymore. And this is something where we need to find solutions to help the farmer. So, yeah, of course, when you talk about sustainable intensification, you're talking about the drive for efficiency. And we're looking to how we can squeeze more efficiency out of the system. So this graph is just an example of the lysine requirements of pigs, and you can see here, this is for a number of pigs. They all have their own lysine requirements, and this research team is searching for more efficient ways to feed those individual pigs. So really trying to deal with the individual level and improve the efficiency that way by precision feeding. From the sow perspective, from the piglet production side, we see that sows were once producing maybe 20 or so piglets weaned per sow per year, and now it's gone to 30 and 40, in fact, in Denmark. So we're seeing a big increase in efficiency there. And what is the end result? Well, there is some vices that we're seeing on the farm. So when you have efficient animals, you also see more issues when it comes to aggression levels on the farm. And also that becomes a bigger challenge, of course, when the industry is faced with criticism from society to prevent or to stop manipulation. So in other words, tail docking, castration. These become bigger issues to deal with when you have highly efficient animals, of course. And it gives rise to things, people reacting to the industry and trying to come up with ways to make our industry obsolete. But we see, and our approach is to try and support farmers with technology. And in that way, we believe that we can enable a farmer to come closer to the animal, because he needs that now. He needs the technology to get to that level where they were in the past with respect to the understanding of the individual animal. And there is a lot of solutions there, but still there is a lot more to do. And what I want to do today is present some of the technologies that we're looking at in terms of pig production. So what we're really trying to do in our research team is to create a kind of digital twin of pigs. So we look at how we're monitoring the pigs. We try to monitor every important aspect of the pig's environment and the pig response themselves. Our main technologies are in video monitoring and sound monitoring, and also some wearable technologies for physiological measurements, for instance. Linking that then with health, behavior, growth, emotion, and stress. And how do we support the farmer? Well, we need to feed this information into a real-time management and support system, or early warning system, and then allow him to hit his sustainability indicators while achieving a decent level of profitability. So that's the end goal. That's what we're trying to achieve. And we see, we're trying to follow and trying to push as well the trends in the industry. We look to what's happening in the different sectors, the different industrial sectors, and the different generations of technology development. And we see now we're at the phase where there is more concentration on big data and AI, and also this concept of digital twinning. So really trying to get more understanding of the system that you have in your factory or in our world on the farm, and to respond in a better way to the needs of the system, which is the animal in our case. And of course, we deal with completely different signals to what they deal with in other industries. There you have very nice steady state signals, but when it comes to animals, every animal has their own pattern of behavior and responds differently to different inputs. And so we term them as complex, individually different, and they're time varying, of course, and dynamic systems. So we need to be able to deal with this kind of data and manage these animals, given that they respond in a different way. So what I'll go through now is the different parts of what we call digital twinning. So looking to the different elements that are important to the farmer, and how can we extract more information from the farm. And the first aspect is the growth monitoring, so the growth or the weight evolution of the pig. And there we have done a lot of work in our team in the past to extract geometrical parameters from video data and link that then to weighing scale information to come up with automatic weighing system using cameras. And in this case, the camera detects when the animal is in a reasonable position to take a weight estimation. So that system that was developed in the past, and we see now more and more people are coming into the market, picking up the science and moving forward with it, going from two-dimensional camera weighing now to 3D camera weighing, and those solutions are now coming more strongly onto the market. So there was a lot of science, and now it's really going in and meeting the needs of the farmer. The next step in this, of course, is trying to take it to the next level. So linking this measurement, the measurement of growth evolution, to the feed input, so that we can really tune the feed delivery to the pen and to the individual animals, so they are growing as efficiently as possible. So this is some research coming out of Canada, and they show here that, yeah, you can really control the feed with precision feeding system and reduce the amount of protein and the amount of nitrogen excreted without having a significant effect on weight gain, for instance. So it's really, there is a lot of potential that we can squeeze out of the technology yet. Another thing that we're really interested in is the behavior monitoring, and for this we use a video-based approach generally. And in recent times we've done a lot of work on this. We've looked at different ways from very basic levels on traditional computer vision approaches using pixel changes in an image to detect activity levels. And that we moved from there with the help of some USDA funding and some excellent collaboration with researchers in Michigan State University, Professor Janice Siegfried and colleagues there, to try and move forward with the development of tools to detect aggression levels better and other features, other behavioral characteristics. So we use deep learning approaches because it proves to us we could see the potential in this technology to detect aggression, also detect differences between behaviors that might not be so evident. And the case we took was piglets drinking versus piglets playing with the drinker, and we found it worked quite well. Then we moved into trying to detect feeding and individualize the feeding, again with deep learning approach. And finally, we went to the stage of tracking objects and tracking the pigs in order to, first of all, detect the engagement with enrichment material, and then towards detecting, for instance, tail biting. And for that, we needed to monitor and track the actual movement of the pigs themselves. So I'll take you on some of the things we did. We started on this. This is work that was done a few years ago, again with a 3D camera, and here the processing was based on moving pixels and to capture the level of aggression. It worked reasonably well, a reasonable level of accuracy for the classifier. And we went on recently and tried to improve that with deep learning approaches, and we found that we could really get a good level of classification with this technique. We did experiments with the University of Michigan, and yeah, Janice Siegfried did the etiological work, and we did the computer algorithms. So we were really able to find a technology that could classify aggression behaviors very well. We used an approach that combined convolutional neural networks with long short-term memory. These are deep learning approaches that enabled us to extract the features and classify the behavior very well. So it worked quite well. These are some images to show what the models were training on. These are just feature maps to show that there was an evolution of the pattern of behaviors for aggressive states, whereas there wasn't such an evolution for non-aggressive states. And we were able to get a reasonably good level of accuracy with this approach. So we find it's very interesting, and then we moved forward to other different applications. Another application was on feeding. Here we applied deep learning to try and capture the amount of time the animals were at the feeder. And then we did some other image processing to identify the pigs, given that there was numbers written on the back of the pigs. So we could tell how much time each individual pig spent eating at the feeder. And it worked, again, reasonably well. This is the deep learning side, which was to capture the group level activity. And then on this side, we identified the pigs. Of course, the next stage in all of this is to try and identify the pigs without the need of marking their backs. And I think that would be a fantastic progress. Maybe we can achieve that again with the state-of-the-art computer vision technologies, but we've yet to see that. And of course, we were able to quantify feeding time. And the information we can extract here, this is just the basics. We can go a lot further, look to frequency, link it with genotypes, and we can really go to the next level with this type of data. We've also looked to the enrichment behavior, the enrichment engagement of pigs with different objects. And here we had different types of objects. We had a ball which was a blue spiky ball, we had an orange ball, and we just had a stick. And we worked with the University of Vienna in this work to classify these kind of behaviors. And what we did was we just took a zone around the object and looked into that zone and just determined if the pigs were engaging with the object or not. And the key thing is the zone would move if the pigs were playing with the object. So we're able to classify it quite easily. And this is here on the left-hand side is what we were trying to do in the search for the object. We transformed it into a different color space, and then we detected the object, and then we just drew a zone around the object. And then on the right-hand side, that was just classifying the behavior. In other words, the interaction with the object. And that's how we determined whether it was interacting or not with the enrichment material. And from this, we just got, again, a very basic result. We can go a lot further, but we looked a little bit to the preference, and we saw, yeah, the pigs really enjoyed this blue spiky ball. So they were really playing with this, whereas they got bored more readily with the other enrichment materials. And the last application on this is a bit more sophisticated. This was looking to the application of tail biting, which is a really big problem. And for this, we needed more sophistication. We needed to think about, okay, can we detect the moving pigs? Can we detect the interaction between those moving pigs and classify that tail biting motion accurately? And again, this was some work that we did with the University in Vienna, who supplied this data, and the collaboration was fantastic with them. And this is the framework that we applied. So we detect each pig in every frame of the video. Then we apply some rules to confirm that the pig that we're following is the same pig from one frame to the next. So we can start tracking the pig in that way. And then we start to look at the pairwise interactions and then classify the behavior using action recognition, which again is this LSTM CNN approach, and that allows us to classify the tail biting action. This is just the object detection method. We use YOLO or a single shot detector. We tested a very range of different models, but they all work reasonably well. And it's quite interesting, in fact, how well they work. This is a really interesting domain at the moment. This is the tracking part. So we applied some matching scores or some rules here, determined the score, the matching scores, in other words, how well we could match one pig in one frame to the same pig in another frame, and in that way capture the movement of the pig throughout the sequence of frames. And once we were able to track the pigs, we then just crop the area around those pigs and look to the recognition of the behavior. So that's when we started to classify the behavior. So we looked, in this case, there could be a couple, these two pigs could be interacting, these two pigs could be interacting, these pigs could be interacting. So we separated them all out from the scene and then built the classifier based on that information. And then the classifier is based again on the CNN LSTM approach. This is the approach that we've used with good success. and we believe we can go further. There is newer models coming up that seem more accurate, but this approach has worked really well for us. And this can give you just an overview. So we detect every pig in each frame, and then we implement those rules to track the pig in the motion, and then we just crop around the pigs. And that's when we do the classification into tail biting or no tail biting. Now I'll just go through briefly some other things that we've been busy with. So vocalization is also another thing that we like to work on in the research team. The research team was part of the development of a spin-off company called SoundTalks, which now have taken the pig cough monitoring system, which is a microphone system to detect the respiratory health of pigs. They've taken that really successfully to the market, and they're able to detect really sick pigs and give the farmer and the vet an alert in plenty of time so action can be taken. And this is kind of just a trace that shows that this monitoring system really works. Pigs can, you can detect the evolution of how sick the pigs get and the influence of the treatment and whether it works or not, whether it's being picked up properly. And it can really help the farmer in optimizing his treatment. So this is the current solution. Of course, they include other sensors and and interact with different stakeholders. So now it's quite a successful thing in the market. But in the research team, we go a step further. We look now these days to different vocalizations that might be linked with welfare, screaming, grunting, squealing. Classify these, and our next stage is to try and integrate these in a measure of welfare. So we believe vocalization is also very interesting for welfare, and it's not just the movement of the pigs alone. Another thing that we've been trying to work more on is the physiological monitoring of pigs. So trying to get some information on the stress of pigs. Of course, this requires the use of sensors that needs to be worn by the animals, and then it can become a challenge, of course, to keep this on the pig, because when they're in a group house situation, other pigs will find these kind of technologies interesting to eat. So we start on this type of work, and we look to see what can be the potential for the future. We started in collaboration with Purdue University, and we gave pigs different stimuli. So this was an enrichment stimuli. It was just a towel. We also gave them another stimuli, which was an air horn that gave them a fright. And we measured heart rate, activity from this belt. And then we divided the heart rate into its different components. So what we said was, when the pig is moving, there is some heart rate that's required for that moving, because when you do some exercise, your body needs to pump more blood around your body. And then there is a baseline heart rate, which is here. This is the baseline heart rate. This is the movement heart rate. And then there's a heart rate left over, which is the stress heart rate. So that's the heart rate due to the stimuli. And there we were able to get how much heart rate was left over in each of those cases. So for instance, here was the response to the scare, to that air horn. And you could see that the pig got a fright. There wasn't a lot of motion, but there was a big increase in heart rate. But the heart rate came down quite quickly, and it came down even more quickly the more used to the air horn that the pig became. So it was interesting to see those kind of dynamics. But also what was also interesting was when you gave the pig the towel, a positive enrichment, that mental energy, or that mental heart rate didn't, it didn't peak instantly, but especially in this case for pig 2, you can see it evolved over time. So it's a slow build-up, and these kind of patterns are interesting. It might help us in the future to detect and separate positive mental states and positive affective states from negative affective states. But of course, you need a good way to monitor the heart rate. We've looked to different technologies. PPG seems to be interesting, and PPG on the ear seems to be quite accurate. So it could be a way in the future to monitor the heart rate by using PPG on the ear. And I think there is some companies are already looking to this technology. Just a couple of last things. I think in the future is to bring all this information together. So we are also to blame in that we're looking at different aspects of the system. We're trying to monitor it as best as we can. But in the end, the value for the farmer can only be, will be really realized when this data is brought together, of course. And there is quite a lot of people busy with it. There is this company in Denmark called IQ in a Box. They have a cloud platform, and they work in collaboration with the scientists in the University of Copenhagen, and they're bringing new algorithms to the cloud quite quickly. So it's an interesting model. Other sensor companies are doing the same thing. This is another company in Denmark and another company in Portugal. Let's see if there will be a kind of a company that wins out in terms of these platforms. But I think there will always be a platform which offers something different. But the key thing is that these platforms enable far more value creation than just a single device on its own. So it's a very interesting space. Okay, so one last thing I want to cover is what are the things that we really need to think about when we develop solutions for farmers. And one of the questions that we often get is that this technology is really driving livestock production towards industrialization. That's something that comes back from society a lot, and yeah, but they often you need to direct them that it's not just the technology, but it's actually the industry, and that's been driven by the behavior of consumers. Yeah, consumers like fast food. They're eating more protein sources, so therefore, of course, the industry is becoming more industrialized, and we're trying to support that, of course, in a more animal welfare friendly way. We want to bring the management to an individual animal, even though we're moving towards greater levels of industrialization, but also we can think about changing systems. And I think PLF and the technology can support how we rethink systems. Another question is, how will this make money for the farmer? The last thing he wants to do is be sitting in front of all these screens with data coming every direction, not knowing how to act on this information. And of course, that means we need business models, we need other stakeholders who can create value from the data and not expect the farmer to take the lion's share of the cost of this type of system. So it's really collaborative thinking, and that's needed to bring the technology to the farmer as well. And then often we get the question, will it make farmers less capable? Because you have a solution that tells him the answer for everything. And I like to refer to this data or this study which says that sat-navs switch off parts of the human brain. And some work in the University College London actually proved that that this is scientifically the case. And of course, yeah, you get stories like woman follows GPS into lake, and yeah, I can tell you stories of people I know who do silly things following GPS directions. And but of course, the thing is, when people become reliant on the technology and it gives false positives, or it doesn't give the completely accurate solution, then it can be catastrophic. So it's important that we consider this and ensure that we upskill and enable farmers to work with this, but don't rely on it. So their skills are really vital to enable the solution to work in the future. Okay, so that's me finished. I'd like to, again, thanks for the invitation and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Excellent presentation. Really appreciate your and your team's efforts, and really great points made at the end of the presentation too. So much to think about. And at the end is in the way we use these technologies to make the producer, the farmer, more capable and to increase his profitability, always looking to the animal in the best treatment, best well-being. So appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next presentation, we have the application and uses of remote measurement technologies by Jim Cairns from Remote Insights. Jim is the founder at Remote Insights, and he provides executive leadership, strategic and tactical planning and execution, market analysis, and all. He has his team he has in his teams rapidly addressing industry needs and are a key player in the smart farming today. We appreciate his and his team contribution. Welcome.
Great. Thank you, David. Appreciate you and the organizers giving us the opportunity to speak here. And I hope everybody in the audience is doing well amidst these very, very crazy times. As David mentioned, I'm Jim Cairns. I'm founder and CEO of Remote Insights. We're a team of technical experts in wireless sensors, artificial intelligence, scalable data platforms, and mobile applications. What we've, we couple this expertise with guidance from our advisors and producers and other partners in the industry to make sure that we're creating solutions, leveraging off of our expertise, creating solutions that are going to address some of the fundamental problems that we have. And one thing that becomes very apparent is that there's a shortage of skilled labor, high turnover rates. The ratios of skilled employees on staff make it very difficult for the adequate observations to be made. So using the feedback that we've received and the guidance that I had just mentioned, we've come up with two solutions that I'll speak to today. The first is our Sow Insight solution. This monitors the behavior of pigs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to detect essentially anomalies in behavior patterns. Right? And these anomalies we've correlated to the onset of illness or first expressions of estrus and other events, such as nesting behavior or detecting labor or the amount of feeding occurring during the lactation process. All of this with the intent of early intervention to make sure that the well-being of the animal is increased, and increasing productivity by notifying employees where they need to be and what actions they need to take. This solution is also used for research, and it's been used by pharmaceutical companies, genetic firms, and producers, as well as universities. And again, it's in the same context where we're monitoring the behavior, essentially the training of each individual as a part of the study, and looking for deviations that may result from the variable that's being studied. So it could be a new vaccine, or it could be different genetic strains, or it could be different feed types or feeding frequencies. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on that. The second solution that I'll briefly speak to is our Count Insights, right? And that Actually, as I say it, it sounds a little bit like Count Dracula, but count insights. This addresses a more tactical problem that we heard that's very pervasive in the industry. For any of you that have been tasked with the issue of counting pigs as they're being moved or shipped, you realize how difficult it can be. And miscounts can cause real logistics errors as well as cost real money to the farmer. So what we have done is we've automated that count process, and I'll elaborate a little bit on that. And it incorporates some of the technologies that were spoken to by the earlier presenters, that being machine learning, object recognition, and using video frames, so tracking it frame to frame. So some of what I'll cover will sound familiar from the prior presentations. Let me start with, again, Sow Insights solution. It's, again, designed to detect anomalies in behavior. And the way that we're detecting this behavior is, and I'll go into more insight in the next slide, but we're looking for the trending of these behaviors to identify certain types of events. Again, it could be health issues or estrus, just to mention two of them. The way that we're doing this is, if you see the circle in the lower left-hand corner, that's the ear tag. So this is done using a Bluetooth wireless ear tag applied using any standard Allflex or Destron pliers. The behavior tag, or B tag, as we refer to it, has an accelerometer in it. And these accelerometer readings are measuring the head movement of the pig. And periodically, that data is sent up to a gateway, and that gateway forwards it on to our cloud platform, which is leveraging off of Google's cloud platform, right? The tools and services that they have there. Once it's on the cloud platform, machine learning models analyze the data, and they come up with predictions as to the behavior that pig was representing to generate those accelerometer readings. We further trend these behaviors over periods of time, and we're looking for deviations in the individual trends. And one thing that we've noted is we went into this actually knowing very little about the physiology of pigs, but again, we've received great guidance over the years. We had limited appreciation, as well as, you know, some of our customers who are long time, decades in the industry. I think it was surprising to all of us the dramatic variance that you have in the individual behavioral baselines. And it really underscored the value of not just taking general measurements of the herd, but getting down to the specific individuals, because they, just like humans, have individual traits, individual mannerisms, and something that may raise an alarm for one may not need raise an alarm for another, right? So with this information, as I mentioned, it goes up to the cloud. We execute our machine learning models. We extract what we predict what behavior that was. We trend the behaviors, and then we look for anomalies, deviations in those trends, right? And in certain cases, we have strong correlations to particular events, such as illness, and I'll get in a little bit deeper on how we've correlated that information, but also with the onset of estrus. And this is another example of where one estrus curve for one gal is very different potentially from another, right? So having a large sample size to be able to do an accurate prediction is really critical as we analyze this and then send notifications to employees to take an action, right? So the overall flow of data, we're gathering accelerometer information from the pig. That's going up to the cloud. We execute machine learning models. We extract what behavior the pig likely exhibited. We trend that behavior. We look for anomalies or deviations in those trends that have been correlated to specific events. And then we notify employees of those events, so those deviations. So it may be that we see a dramatic decrease in activity levels. So we send them to the specific location. So sow 1, 2, 3 in the north gestation barn in crate, B24, right, is exhibiting abnormal behavior, right? please go and inspect, take the temperature, and report to the veterinarian, right? That would be an example. Or the onset of estrus, and here's the appropriate time that they should likely be inseminated. Speaking of estrus, the slide that you see here is an example of raw accelerometer information in the top panel, right? So those are the XYZ readings that we're getting straight off the pig up in the cloud. And then the next panel, the center panel, is actually after we've classified those raw accelerometer readings into behaviors and we're trending those behaviors. In the case of estrus detection, we apply a second layer of logic, right? And it's really just a series of algorithms that through trial and error we've determined can best tease out when we see the dramatic increases. Keep in mind that we have to deal with the daily patterns of the pigs, such as when they tend to rise, given the sun rising, as well as when they're fed, and factor that out so that we can truly tease out when their activity level has increased relative to their normal baseline. And we can raise the flag that estrus has begun, and here is the likely time period where it's best to inseminate, which you see in the bottom panel, right? Which is the result of that second layer of logic being applied to the behavior trends. Those two vertical lines for reference are when this particular sow was actually serviced. Now, in addition to overall activity, what we're also doing, one of the behaviors that we're categorizing is when they exhibit feed behavior. And I say it as feed behavior as opposed to feeding. It's because the motion of the head has been correlated. So the accelerometer readings resulting from a particular motion of the head has been documented on video of them feeding, right? That's what we use to train the machine learning model to categorize feeding events. However, we quickly found out that we couldn't differentiate between actual feeding and sham chewing, right? So the desire to feed, but there was no feed. So they may be chewing on the concrete floor, as you all have witnessed many times, I'm sure. So what we're seeing here is, again, just feed activity, extracting out any other active time periods, right? So we're classifying a couple different attributes, one when they're dormant, another when they're active, right? So that being there is motion. And then a subcategory of when they're active is when we think they're feeding. Again, that includes sham chewing. And then we also have hyperactive events, which I'll elaborate on in just a moment. So this slide is a result of one of the many challenge studies that we've been a part of. We're extremely fortunate to have collaborated with pharmaceutical companies as well as genetic firms and some producers to be involved in these studies, because it's a tremendous way for us to validate that our solution can detect, and a noted decrease in activity can be strongly correlated to the onset of a disease, right? And this has been proven in trial after trial. And actually, one of the trials that we recently conducted was using the cough monitoring solution that was mentioned by the prior presenter. And we saw a very strong correlation between the cough monitoring solution and the decrease in activity levels that we were able to detect. If we think about what's really driving us to enter into this market, as I mentioned in one of the first slides, it's to address the lack of skilled labor on site, right? And what that results in the case of detecting illness, is you have folks that may not know exactly what to look for. And they're only allotted the time, given the ratio of sows in this particular case, in the case of sows to employees, to make lengthy observations of the herd, right? So they may pass by, and like all wounded or injured or sick animals, they want to look their best as a potential predator comes by. So it's very difficult for the untrained eye to detect when an animal is sick, right? And that's one of the benefits that we're seeing from the use of this solution to monitor 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, what their activity levels look like, and to be able to note when that individual has really decreased its activity level. And again, what we found is that activity levels, a noted decrease in activity levels for one is very different from another. So they may have a much higher baseline as far as their activity levels. So very important to note. Here we see, actually, I'm going to skip through that and we'll go through the, hold on just a sec. Let's go through this. Okay, so the ferrying events that you see here, this is not actually activity. We were simply monitoring or truly just monitoring the feed events. What we were most curious about is the ladder fade when they were lactating to see whether or not they were having taking enough feed so that they would build back their energy stores. So at the point of weaning, they would be prepared for another parity cycle. Or if not, they could be a candidate for culling, right? What we found from this was the solution was actually very good at detecting nesting behavior, nesting in labor. And we've begun to draw correlations to the onset of those activities to the probable time of delivery. We still need larger data sets to come up with a truly accurate prediction, but we do see some correlation in the initial data that we have. What's also of interest here is that if you look at the resulting litter size and you look at the baseline, the average of the feed events, they really vary pretty dramatically. In the bottom one, number 207, it's much, much lower, but you also see that it was carrying a much smaller litter. It turned out to be actually a very healthy sow, but it was ill early on in the process, so it may have had early aborts. But again, individual data, just emphasizing the value of that. Now, in these graphs, this is actually one of the more interesting studies that we were a part of. Let me bring up a video just to add a little color to this. So we were brought in by some folks to see if we could leverage off of the solution to detect an active tail biter. And we very quickly realized that the actual act of tail biting is really brief. It takes a second or two maximum. And what we saw was not a unique accelerometer pattern being generated by the head movement where we could call it out. Very difficult to detect. So we looked at it a little bit further and we examined the video that was that we were taking to try and correlate different phenotypes. And we found that, as you see with this pig in the video, she is the active tail biter. She's extremely hyperactive. As a matter of fact, she turned out to be twice as hyperactive as the next hyperactive pig in that pen. So again, small sample size, and we have a few other examples of this. But what turned out was the active tail biting behavior was best identified by the associated behaviors that that particular animal exhibited. And in this case, it was truly hyperactive behavior. And as you see from what's highlighted in green, the top panel, those are the number of hyperactive events that we were classifying over periods of time. And it really stood out like a sore thumb, and it was very easy for us to identify this. Set aside the video, but it was very easy to identify just using the accelerometer data that this one was truly hyperactive. And in a small sample set, we were able to correlate that extreme hyperactive behavior to aggressive behavior. Let's see here. These graphs are from a feed study that Dr. Hayford Manu at the University of Minnesota conducted. It was to identify the stress levels of pregnant sows by changing the feeding frequency. Right, so he was taking cortisol readings from them periodically, and then he had the various groups, and feeding them at different frequencies, and he even shifted the times in some cases as well. One of the big benefits that we saw from this study, and these again were pregnant sows during gestation. One of the big benefits that we saw from this was we did see very strong correlation to the increase in activity levels from what we would expect in that phase of the gestation cycle to the cortisol readings. So again, what we would expect is a certain baseline of activity for sows in this period. But essentially what was induced was higher stress levels because of the changing in the feeding frequency and timing, again, in some cases. And the cortisol levels would increase. And we saw that with the increased levels of activity too, essentially the agitation. So again, it was a very nice validation to be able to say that the increased levels of activity that we saw when not expected were being correlated to increased stress levels. Let's see. One additional feature of the solution, and I won't go into in depth, is since we are using a Bluetooth ear tag, we place something very similar to the tags in the crates. So when the sow or animal is moved into a particular pen or crate, we automatically detect that and report up. So sow 1, 2, 3 is now in crate A56 in the north barn, right? Removing the manual process of somebody having to write that down on a piece of paper and then somebody back in the office having to scribe it, where there's potentially some errors involved there as well. So it's essentially automating some of the steps in the process, trying to take advantage of that wherever possible. And this is just an example of the health and history data, and I won't go into details there. This is probably more interesting to you all, and that is what you see here is the raw accelerometer readings from one sample. And again, what we've done is taken raw accelerometer readings, and this is weeks upon weeks early on in the process, and we continue to do this. We'll take set up video cameras to monitor the behavior of the sows, and they have the ear tags generating the accelerometer readings. And then for what we see on the video, distinct behaviors, we will take that section of accelerometer readings and use that to train the machine learning models, right? So one example would be, we went through, again, days upon days, weeks upon weeks of watching videos, and we noticed that when they're sleeping, the accelerometer readings will occur because they'll get these dream shudders, or I'm not sure how the industry would classify it, but essentially it is during the course of dreaming, you will see them shaking, right? And we wanted to rule that out as not being active, but being dormant. Or when they were feeding. We tried to do it for sows in crates when they were standing and when they were laying down, the motion of standing up and laying down. However, they were too subtle and they varied too much for us to be able to accurately detect it. So right now, the core, once again, and I think I mentioned this before, the core behavior attributes that we're detecting are when they're dormant, when they're active, when they're feeding, and different levels of hyperactive behavior. Now, the tag itself is designed to last 3 years. So essentially the long lifespan of a sow on farm. Weighs about 19.5 grams. And let me show you an example of the type of testing. Let's see. Here we go. So as you know, pigs don't like technology in barns. So we've had to go through multiple iterations of the tag to ensure that it will hold up. And we've enlisted the help of some volunteers to test our tags here. As you see her just chewing away on them. This happens to, I think this example is probably the third iteration that we had on the tags. First iteration, well, actually, it was probably the second iteration that we had. We applied them to 100 or so gilts, and they were fairly small when we applied them, and everything was running just well, just fine. And after about a month and a half, as their jaw strength increased, all of a sudden we saw a drop in the data that was being reported. And we visited the barn, and about 90 out of the 100 were now laying on the floor. Essentially, there was a fracture point, a break point. So as their pen mates would chew on them, they'd bend the tag, and then it would essentially snap. That's one of the reasons that you see that reinforcement heading up toward the hole. That was directly as a result of that. And actually, we're going through another iteration of the tags, because we noticed that some of the sows, as you know, you get a 500-pound sow, and when she's not happy and she shakes her head, the tag will collide with the bars of farrowing crate or even in gestation. And that concussion, we really need to dampen essentially the force conveyed, the convective force conveyed to the PCB, the electronics on the inside. So as you all are probably very well aware, when you introduce new technology to a barn, it may work extremely well in your lab or on your bench, but when you put it in the barn, that's a completely different environment. And we have spent a majority of our time hardening the solution to ensure that they'll work well. And a lot of tags have been left on the floor, but we're at a pretty good point at this moment. I'm going to shift gears and talk about the pig count, or the count insight solution. And for this, you know, as I discussed before, the let's see if we can do this. We'll bring up the solution. I'll give you just some visuals to watch as I talk through how we do this. So think of a sow farm. Our focus right now is being able to count weaned pigs as they're either being shipped or moved within the facility. We deploy a server so that all of the video can stay on site as we process it to identify the pigs. And there you see each one of them being labeled. The way it's done is a video camera is positioned above a hallway, and mobile application, it's actually not, it's a web application on the local area network. So servers deployed in the manager's office and from the manager's laptop, or a mobile device that is attached to the same local area network, so same Wi-Fi system, for instance, that will be in the barn, can access the server and run the web service. The intent is to try and keep a majority of the communications and the processing, let me pause this for a moment, and the processing on site, because we're very sensitive to the bandwidth constraints that most barns have, right? So once again, the system, you can start it using this application. The video stream will go to the server. The machine learning models using object detection will track the pigs moving from frame to frame. And then when they cross the virtual threshold, as you saw back here, when they cross the virtual threshold, either going up where it's incremented or going back when they turn around, the count is decremented, allows you to arrive at the count. And then once the employee hits stop, the count is stopped, and that information is logged, time of day, location, what the actual count was. And we also provide fields for, the employee to enter in any manual count if there is one, as well as the load ID. And this we find very important because this metadata, that being the count, the timestamp, the location, a manual count, and load ID, is sent up to the cloud. Bring this back up, is sent up to the cloud for integration to other systems. So you may have an accounting system, or you may have, whether it be MetaFarms or Porcitech or any of the other solutions out there, you may want that data integrated into that system so that you can handle your logistics as well as accounting more appropriately. It's easily done. We have APIs that allow for that integration to take place. I should also note that the video that results in the count is retained on site for a year in case there are any disputes. So in the context of dispute resolution, we can manually inspect that video to see if there were errors, and oftentimes there are errors made by the machine learning model, and report on what the accurate count truly is. Right now, we are sitting at an accuracy level for weaned pigs at about 99.5 when there's a decent flow, right? When there's a confluence, so when there's backup of pigs and we simply lose sight of the pig, that impacts our accuracy quite significantly. So it's critical when we deploy this solution, and deployment only takes about 4 hours, that we're taking into account what the flow of the animals are to ensure the lowest probability of them becoming all bunched up, because again, that's when we'll lose visibility. At this point in time, that's all I have, and I know when you see this, hopefully there'll be time for questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, for the demo of the two applications. Appreciate your and your team's efforts in our industry.
Great. Thanks once again, David.
Thank you. Well, that completes our session. We thank our speakers for their excellent presentations. These show us that we have a bright future by addressing opportunities with the use of technologies and integrating data for decision making. It is very exciting for us producers to see the speed at which these technologies are scientifically proving to be accurate, easy to implement, and improving human labor. Thank you.